William Blake used to say, nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. And this seems literally to be true. It seems as though, something once articulated, a statement, the reverberations are unto the last syllable of recorded time. Somehow it's all there. Now, when I said these things approached and spoke in English, I didn't mean to make it sound as mundane as it might sound. Greek religion was characterized by what was called the Logos in the Hellenistic period. And the Logos was an informing voice. And all the great thinkers of Hellenistic times, Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, Thucydides, all of these people were in contact with the Logos. It was the sine qua non of Hellenistic religion. And it was a speaking and informing voice that tells you the right way to live. Well, we don't know what to make of this. And at a certain point in the evolution of the Western mind, judging by the writings of people who were contemporaneous with those times, the Logos fell silent. There was actually a date. Some of you may know the story of the fishermen pulling their nets off the Isle of Rhodes, and they heard a voice from the sky say that great Pan is dead. And this was at the change of the eon, the beginning of the age of Aquarius. It was almost as though there was something in the ancient world that has gone latent, that we can no longer touch or imagine. Gordon Wasson, who discovered with his wife Valentina the mushrooms, told a very interesting story in one of his books about how in Mazatecan, the people who are speakers of Mazatecan, when they chant what the mushroom says, they have created a special form for this, which goes like this. Zabuz, 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 tse. This word tse means says. Zabuz, 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 says. Says. I didn't know this at the time I took mushrooms the second time, and in my head I heard the mushroom speaking in English but adding the word says to the end of the sentence. So it was almost like, this thing could speak in Mazatec, it could speak in English, but it always kept its cadence and its structure. The other thing about psilocybin and the DMT thing is that it seems to be a catalyst for glossolalia. This is why I think it must have had something to do with the evolution of language. I mean, when you take psilocybin, you can fall spontaneously into states of glossolalia. Sometimes on DMT, it's almost impossible to control. It just spontaneously comes out. Yeah. Oh, what is glossolalia? Glossolalia, well, here's an example of it, then I'll define it. Sie ding quap maktiki pitech kving huade molde ruf nubke henget e faps titulch kvem bedigem hegengtecht. It's language-like activity in the absence of meaning. And it's a very interesting thing neurologically, because notice that speech, ordinary speech, is this highly variable stream of data. We are set up to make these small mouth noises. As a public speaker, I'm very aware of the fact that one can speak without tiring almost longer than you can do any other major human motor activity. And but the glossolalia, such as I just did, it is clearly under the control of rules, but it is not, there is no meaning conventionally conceived of there, but there is syntax. And I think probably that language was invented millennia before meaning, and that you could almost call you could almost call language toneless singing, and that people used to sit around the campfire and amuse each other by making funny noises. As a kid, I used to do this. And then it was only much, much later that anything approaching linguistic conventionality was imposed on this, and that that's a lower function. The other thing I want to say about this glossolalia thing is, you may say, well, you're just making it up when I do that. But really, the experience I have when I do it is that I stand aside, then this variable data stream comes out through my mouth. Well, now, it has to reflect something about me. It's a statement about my internal situation in that moment. And it's evolving and changing as rapidly as if I were saying, you know, I had a migraine headache last night, and I got up about 4 and took an aspirin, and you know, I'm telling you about my situation. But the glossolalia must be speaking to something about my situation, or it wouldn't be possible to do it at all. Not only is something not real unless it can be said, but the contrapositive of that is that once something can be said, it becomes almost too real. It displaces other possibilities. I mean, so we're living in a set of constructs, some architectural, some ideological, and they can be very oppressive. I mean, how do you get rid of the notion of linear time and space very easily? It's the slow work of consensus. One of the things that I feel I'm doing very consciously in these kinds of meetings is we're trying to launch and replicate memes. You all know this concept? A meme is the smallest unit of an idea, in the same way that a gene is the smallest unit of organism. And so these things, DMT elves, transcendental object at the end of history, so forth, these are memes. And in the same way that genes are copied and spread around, and that fidelity of copying is the key to genetic success, fidelity of meme replication is the key to communication. I mean, if I give a speech on something and then you hear it and then you go out and somebody says, so what did he say? And you give a completely cockeyed account of what has been said, well, then the meme has been betrayed. But if you can actually transfer the meme to somebody else's mind and then they can copy it and pass it on, then the meme, it's almost as though the ideological environment were like a rainforest. Or a coral reef. Evolution is taking place. Stupid memes, dumb memes, have short lifetimes, and they disappear, you know. And memes of great power are able to thrive in many intellectual and ideological niches and to make many marriages of convenience with other memes, and so they are stabilized and passed along. Somehow we have to become hip to the fact, to the power of language, and instead of just willy-nilly creating linguistic structures sort of ad hoc, we need to begin to consciously engineer our linguistic intent. And then, you know, so far in the 20th century, this has not been a program with a very happy history because only jerks have gotten a hold of it. Nazis and people with narrow social programs. They say, you know, we're not going to call each other Mr. and Mrs. or hey you. We're going to call, everybody's going to call each other comrade. And then this will create the notion of comradeship, which to a certain degree it does. But, you know, manipulating these things for political ends, I mean, the Jews, it was okay to put Jews in ovens because the official language for talking about Jews was that they were Untermensch, subhuman, not like us, whoever we are. So once the definition had been changed, people said, well, it's okay to mistreat Jews. You know, they're not even really people. And this kind of thinking goes on all the time. It's called stereotyping, and it always is an easier substitute it's a cheap substitute for clear thinking. David Brown asked me the question, what about life after death? And it was somewhat of a sidebar. The Buddhists at the folk level in India do say you cannot attain enlightenment unless your mother is dead, which is a kind of an odd notion, seeming to imply that she had to precede you into hyperspace. When you die, what you do is you literally, as appears to happen, you dissolve. And where you go is forward and backward into time, not like a gas released into time, but along the tracks and trails of the genetic machinery. In other words, you flow into your children, and you become, let's make a very simple model and say at the moment of death you become your children and your parents. A few moments later you become your grandchildren and your grandparents. You're spreading down. It's almost as though the thing which you were, which was this focus of ego and individuality, then it dies, and it's almost as though the mountain begins to slump back into the generalized pool of consciousness and being. That's why I have somewhat less patience maybe than I should have with the idea of channeling and come as you were parties and that sort of thing, because it seems to me the key to understanding the idea of reincarnation and past lives is that you were everybody. Of course, that's who you are. Here comes everybody. You know, you weren't just that shepherd girl or that Roman emperor or that Greek fellow. You're everybody, and you can find your way into the great genetic telephone system and ring anybody's bell in history. Well, then it would be absurd to claim you were that person. That would be as absurd as claiming that anybody you could call on the telephone is who you are. No, it's that we are everyone. And, you know, the great turning object in hyperspace that is the genetic, transdimensional object casts off glinting reflections of this personality, that personality. And astrology has a role to play here and other things. But the bottom line is we are all drawn of the same stuff. I think one of the most profound insights you can have on psychedelics, and I certainly have it, is that we are all interchangeable. You know, anybody could do my job, and I'm pretty confident I could do almost anybody's job. We define ourselves otherwise, but in watching the rise of my own career, it's a kind of being deputized, chosen for the job. It's just they said, well, he can do it. He has the gift of gab, so give him the credit line. But it could have been anybody. Our uniqueness is real on one level, but on another level, it's fairly illusory. It's sort of a coincidentia positorum. You have to hold these two antithetical things in your mind at once in order to correctly perceive the proper level of ambiguity that's resident in reality. It ain't simple, folks. Yeah.
Can I just ask this question? Do I understand you to say that to find our truer self, we have to go back to the worm-like stage and reach out for the pharmacological, the natural pharmacological that is in the Amazon basin and all those plants and things to find our true inner being, ego, whatever?
Well, I don't think we have to go back as far as the worm-like stage. I think what we have to do is we have to get out of history. History is a con game run by frightened men and their obedient stooges. We had a moment of happiness. There was a moment of completion. I guess I should explain my position on this. You see, there have always been dominance hierarchies in primates. As far back as you go, clear back to squirrel monkeys, there are what are called male dominance hierarchies. Well, so then in us, this was interrupted by psilocybin use over a period of probably a couple of 100,000 years. The psilocybin, forget that it's psychedelic for a moment. Just think of it as an inoculation against ego. And so for 200,000 years or so, it was a dietary item which suppressed this normal monkey behavior. And so then females were shared, the sexual style was orgiastic, there were no awareness of lines of male paternity, and the children belonged to the group. This was not, quote-unquote, natural. The natural way is for the men to dominate, to control the females, to the old tooth and claw. But for a couple of 100,000 years, it was artificially interrupted by the presence of mushroom in the Paleolithic human diet. Well, then when, because of climatological factors and other factors that we can discuss in another meeting, the mushroom became unavailable, the old monkey behaviors reemerged only about 12,000 years ago. But in the previous 200,000 years, language had been discovered, fire, tool making, song, a whole bunch of forward leaps had been made. Well then, when the psilocybin was withdrawn and the patterns of male dominance reasserted themselves in an environment where fire and language had been achieved, it exacerbated it. It made it much more nightmarish. It made it much more difficult to step away from. And all of history is the unhappy story of essentially our withdrawal and our agony over being unable to reach this connection back into the Gaian mind, which when we had it, we lived in Eden. We were balanced. But it faded, and history was the consequence. Now, in the last 50 years, information has arrived on our plate, lo and behold, in the final ticking of the final hour of our dilemma, that actually shows us the way back, if we but have the wisdom to understand this and then the fortitude to apply what we know. One more question.
To talk just for a minute about motivation in relationship to psychoactive substances.
You mean motivation to take psychedelics?
To take action.
To take action. Well, I think, that the psychedelic community has not yet recognized or named itself as a community. We're well behind gays and black people and all these other... We're still trying to figure out if we are a community. And if we are a community and we have a domain of action, I think where it lies, it's not that we're all supposed to become dope dealers, it's that we're all supposed to become artists, that the transformation of culture through art is the proper understanding of what you can do with psychedelics besides blow your own mind. And I really think, what we need to do is put the art pedal to the floor and understand that this is art. We are involved in some kind of enormous piece of performance art called Western civilization. And, it's been a C- performance so far, and they're just about to reach out with the hook and drag us off stage unless we begin pulling rabbits out of the hat pretty furiously. Art is poised for this, but art is ambivalent because the society is ambivalent. That's why meetings like this, where you actually hear it said, the sooner the better. The clock is ticking. This is not a test. There will not be a retry. This is the window of opportunity between the unknown and eternity. If not taken, then the entire enterprise could be lost. The whole thing, from the cave paintings at Lascaux to Whitney Houston, it could all go down the drain if we don't, act to preserve it through an act of human cognition plus courage. The rainforests themselves may eventually be saved. Very large conservation organizations are attempting to do that. But the medical knowledge of how to use these plants is being lost at a tremendous rate. It will disappear in the next 30 years. There's no question about that, because these people are the young people are not learning the shamanism. They're moving into the cities, and you only have to break that kind of chain in an oral tradition. You only have to have a one-generation break, and the 50,000 years of accumulated medical information is gone. So even in today's high-tech world, 85% of all drugs sold over the counter can be traced to plants. So if we're serious about, a cure to aid, new kinds of contraception, new forms of psychoactive drugs, then this botanical database needs to be preserved. I think that those of us who are experienced with psilocybin are in a position now to offer answers to one of the most perplexing questions in the entire field of biology, which is, how did it happen that over a very brief period of time, less than 2 million years, the brain size of our species doubled, and in doubling became the fastest transformation of a major organ ever recorded in the history of the evolution of life. This is according to Lumsden, who's a very respected evolutionary biologist. This is a truly perplexing problem for evolution. It would be perplexing were it to occur anywhere in the animal phylogeny. But what's of particular embarrassment here is that it occurs in the phylogeny of the animal who invented the theory of evolution. So, it's particularly embarrassing. If we can't account for our own evolution, what depth and breadth has the theory when applied to the rest of nature? And one notion has been that you're looking for a transitional skeleton or intermediate forms. This has now been given up. And by looking at this problem, I have sort of been able to, I think, generate let's call it an idea, a myth, a fantasy, an explanation for our predicament. And it goes very briefly something like this. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies. This goes clear back into very primitive primates like squirrel monkeys. And it is true of us as we sit here in this room. We also have dominance hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies. This is why, what the squawk is in the gender issue is that men have been running everything for a long, long time. But I maintain that there was a period in the history of the primates when male dominance hierarchies were interrupted. And they were interrupted by the presence of an unusual element in the food supply. And this element in the food supply was psilocybin. And it acted as a kind of inoculation or unconscious vaccination against the formation of ego. And that at that moment, with ego, tendency to male dominance, chemically suppressed by mushrooms in the diet, all the qualities that we take to be most human and most ennobling in ourselves emerged. Language, loyalty, community, courage, love, devotion, self-sacrifice, planning. All of these things which distinguish us from the rest of animal nature, I maintain, occurred under the catalytic influence of an exogenous neurotransmitter in the environment that was having profound effects on a monkey that was exploring a new environment and a new dietary habit. And here's the notion. Our remote ancestors reached a kind of evolutionary climactic stability in the arboreal forests of tropical Africa. And like most animal species, that successfully occupies a niche of some sort, we would have stayed that way for millions of years at equilibrium, happily eating fruit and occasionally hurling shit at each other as we conducted ourselves through the forested treetops. And thought would never have entered into the matter. However, the plot thickened about 3 million years ago, when suddenly, and for reasons that are hidden in the heart of the planet itself, the planet began to dry, and the African continent became subject to waves of drought and desiccation. The tropical rainforests which covered Africa began to retreat and be intercut with grasslands. And in these grasslands, a very rich fauna of animal life developed. New kinds of animals, grass-eating, herding animals, ungulate animals, cows, bison, various forms of antelope, so forth and so on. Meanwhile, turning the camera's eye on our remote human ancestors, things are getting tougher up in the treetops. Less fruit, less habitat in which to forage, and whenever an animal gets under dietary pressure, it does what any sensible creature would do. It begins to experiment with new food. It begins to test food in the environment. Now, the reason animals don't ordinarily do this is because foods also contain toxins, and toxins sometimes are mutagenic. So the reason butterflies and birds and all kinds of animals specialize in their diets, it's a strategy to avoid mutation-causing chemicals. Well, so then what happens if you put an animal population under pressure for food and it starts experimenting with new forms of food? It begins having a higher incidence of mutation. And that mutation meets the selective forces of natural selection present in the environment, and lo and behold, you get sudden episodes of evolutionary advance. And I maintain that this is what happened to us on many levels. I mean, we are a kind of monkey, but if you set us next to our nearest relative, there are a lot of things about us that are different. Our hairlessness, the proportion of our skull to the rest of our body is a fetal ratio compared to other primates. Well, among the new foods encountered by these now ground-foraging proto-ancestors of ours were mushrooms growing in the dung of wild cattle in this grassland environment. Now, the astonishing thing about psilocybin in small doses, and this was secured by research done by Roland Fisher in the late 50s, early 60s, is that in very small doses so small that you don't feel buzzed or loaded or anything, in fact you don't notice it, visual acuity increases. You can give somebody 5 milligrams of psilocybin and an hour later give them a standard optometric test, and they will do better than if they hadn't taken the psilocybin. This is because edge detection is sensitized. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out if there's a food in the environment of a hunting and gathering animal that conveys increased visual acuity, it's the equivalent of chemical binoculars, then those animals which accept that food as an item in their diet are going to have greater hunting success than those individuals that do not. And greater hunting success means greater success at feeding your offspring. And that means that there would be an outbreeding of the non-psilocybin using members of the population. In other words, natural selection would then favor those animals admitting the mushroom into their diet. So that little chink in the armor, that little toehold, is sufficient for the long march toward the stars, which is taking place in our species, to begin. The next step is, if you take slightly more psilocybin, you experience what's called arousal. And arousal means a kind of general restlessness, an inability to sit still, a roving and wired kind of attention. And in highly sexed animals like primates, it also means sexual arousal, and in the male, sustained erection. A second factor promoting outbreeding of the non-psilocybin using members of the population. In other words, you see, it was promoting what anthropologists straight-facedly call more successful copulations. And you don't have to be straight-faced, however. So this is the second step. And I believe that the sexual style of these psilocybin-aroused early ancestors of ours was probably orgiastic. This seems reasonable from looking at human styles on the earth today. And I suspect that probably an orgiastic religious style based on the worship of a great horned goddess who was honored at the new and full moon became a religious style that was set in place for 10 or 15,000 years. This is what was going on. Well, now, psilocybin on its own, and even more so in combination with a social style that included orgy, will have the consequences of dissolving boundaries. You know, this is what the orgiastic style does. It erodes the concept of me, and still more the concept of my women, my children, my tools, my territory, my hunting ground. If you have an orgiastic style, the first important consequence is that men cannot trace lines of male paternity. There is no concept for a man of my children. There is only the concept of our children, the tribe, the group, and loyalty is transferred in that direction. The suppression of ego was very real. As I said earlier, in the earlier primate forms, ego, male dominance, was very strong, but it was as though this item in the diet was suppressing this previous rigid male hierarchy, and into the void created by the dissolving of the social glue of these primates, there flowed a whole bunch of new behaviors. Behaviors such as pair bonding based on loyalty and mutuality of need fulfillment, cooperation, appropriate role assignment, so forth and so on. In other words, it got loose, it began to work. You see, every time there was a glaciation, and there have been 9 in the last 1,000,000 years or so, every time there is a glaciation, species, including primates, get locked into islanded areas. Well, then when the ice melts, these previously islanded populations flow together and exchange genes. And there were several waves of human migration out of Africa and into the Middle East. But I maintain, based on the archaeological evidence, that only the last wave of migration out of Africa, which began only 20,000 years ago, were the people anything other than hunter-gatherers. Always before they were just hunter-gatherers. But this last time, in the intervening glacial period, they had learned to domesticate cattle in Africa. And it was almost as though the human population was finding its way toward the cattle. And of course, in the dung of the cattle was the mushroom. So this great horned mother goddess that appears at the dawn of history is a hypostatization of the power of cattle in the human imagination. These behaviors that were developed out of this encounter with psilocybin also involved at higher doses of psilocybin. You know, remember, at very low doses, increased visual acuity. Mid-range doses, orgiastic sexual activity and ego dissolution. At still higher doses, the revelation of a religious tremendum so bizarre and unnerving that even today we, with Husserl and all the rest of it under our belts, can barely face it. In other words, a mystery which for all of our sophistication, the breadth and measure of it can hardly be taken. And that laid the basis for a sense of religio, a sense of ritual, a sense of a relationship to a tremendum. And I don't want to present this psilocybin intoxication entirely as if it were simply ameliorating the earlier evolutionary programming in the primates. It was doing that, but it was doing something else as well, because this mystery at the center of the psilocybin intoxication is not simply the contents of your unconscious mind or unfulfilled fantasy as Freud thought, or it is, in fact, a contact with a Gaian intelligence of some sort. And if you're a rationalist, as I once was on some long-forgotten world, this is an incredibly challenging notion, that what you're getting into is actually some kind of supermind, some kind of organism that is, apparently in the atmosphere, in the water, in the plants, in the land. It's hard to say where it is or what it is, because it was not designed for human apprehension. It has its own ding en siche, its own thing in itself. It's like a god for any century of human description of it, except the 20th, in which we have enough knowledge about the ecosystem to say, well, maybe it's not, as Milton said, the God who hung the stars like lamps in heaven. It isn't that God, but it's the God of the oceans and the jungles and the ice caps and the rivers and the glaciers and the great schools of fish and the deserts. And it's the goddess of the earth. It's the mind of organic life on this planet. And I believe that we were its chosen vessel of manifestation in a certain domain. And this is what the Edenic myth is about. The nostalgia for paradise that haunts our species is a memory of this time, this golden era that ended as recently, as 10,000 years ago. I mean, everything that we call history is a product of the traumatic break in our symbiotic relationship to the earth, occasioned by the loss of the mushroom religion, which was the religion. And, an obvious question that anyone who's gotten this far would ask is, well, if it was so wonderful, why was it lost? Well, it was lost because the same dynamics which created it, which was the progressive drying of the African continent, those forces accelerated and continued, and where there had been Edenic grassland and vast herds and endless supplies of mushrooms, there became desert. There became dry land, scrub, retreating water holes, fewer and fewer mushrooms. The mushroom festivals, which had been at the new and full moon, became fewer in number. The mushroom supply dwindled. Special classes of people had to be appointed who would be the mushroom users. Special times of the year had to be appointed when the mushrooms could be taken. Special places in the rain shadow of mountains and near water holes became the only places where the mushrooms could be found. And at that point, and these are processes which took millennia to occur. At that point, there became an anxiety and concern to preserve the mushrooms so that in abundant times they could be gathered for times when they were scarce. And the strategy that would have naturally been hit upon would be to use honey as a preservative. In a world without refrigeration, honey is an antiseptic medium that caramelizes around fruits and like hummingbird tongues and stuff like that. You're always hearing Romans ate hummingbird tongues in honey. That's why, because it was a preservative. Problem is, honey itself has a perverse and mercurial nature and can change into a psychoactive drug. It can change into mead, which is a form of alcohol. It can ferment and become a kind of proto-beer. Well, in what I develop in my book, Food of the Gods, is the idea that each drug carries baggage that we are generally not aware of. Each drug promotes certain values and suppresses others. So if psilocybin suppressed ego, male paternity, and promoted sexual polymorphically perverse behavior, then and consequent diminishing of ego, then what mead, fermented honey, promotes is the classic things always promoted by alcohol in any form. One, a false sense of verbal facility in the insidious combination with a lowering of sensitivity to social cueing. You know, you can see this in any singles bar on a crowded Saturday night. People drink because they think it makes them clever, and then, able to ignore social cues from those around them, they boorishly proceed with their agenda, which usually involves getting laid or something. And, you know, I think that there was probably 1,000 years in European civilization when very few people experienced sex without being bombed, because that was how people steeled themselves for the experience, you know. It was recommended to give distilled alcohol to soldiers on the brink of battle when it was first invented because it fortified them. Well, as the mushrooms faded, these behaviors that had been previously well established in primates of male dominance and ego returned. So that at the very dawn of human history, you know, let's say 6,000 BC or so, you get, in the absence of the psilocybin, the disease of ego reemerges. It's been suppressed for 50,000 years. Now it spreads through the population like wildfire, and you get urbanization, agriculture. Agriculture leads to surplus. Surplus means an end to nomadic existence. You become sedentary. You build grain towers. You fill these towers with grain. Then you have to defend them against the hungry people from the other tribe. So you get classes. Somebody has to coordinate the defense of this grain tower. Suddenly you have generals, hierarchy, male dominance, warfare, classism, sexism, you name it, you know, and the phonetic alphabet and all the rest of it is not far behind. It's the fall into history. And we are the unhappy inheritors of this situation. And one of the things that is so unique about us is our fascination with drugs. That that elephants will break into compounds to get at rotting papayas, and butterflies go for sugared rum and this and that. But human beings are incredible. And human beings addict to approximately 20 or 30 substances, very tight physiological addictions, and then there's all our ideological addictions, to Marxism, to capitalism, to the Republican Party, you name it. And then we have behavioral addictions of all sorts. Somebody gets up in the morning and throws open their front door, and if the Times isn't lying rolled at their feet with a red rubber band around it, they go into shock because an addiction is being interrupted. The fix, which was supposed to arrive on time, has been delayed, and now this person stomps back into their house, menace to wife and child, because the newspaper didn't arrive on time. So this curious tendency of our species to addict, I think, is because, if a person is an addictive type, then people say, well, they probably were abused in childhood, and this is the consequence of some kind of childhood trauma. Well, I would submit to you that we exhibit this pathology. We appear to be the inheritors of some kind of dysfunctional relationship. And I maintain that it was torn from us at the birth of mind when we were forced out of the African Eden and into, a much drier, harsher Middle Eastern climate where we then had to toil in the vale of sorrows. Well, now what is the point of this? Or is this just some revisioning of archaeology, some egghead game, or what is the point? Well, the point is that the consequences of this dysfunctional behavior stemming from ego and the dominance hierarchy in our behavior has ruined our planet, toxified the air and water, allowed our population to soar beyond the carrying capacity, poisoned our lives with propaganda, and made us each feel guilty, powerless, and doomed. I mean, this is the major riff being run in the society at large, is that we're doomed. We've looted the planet. We've destroyed our children's future. We have the ethics of rats, and now we're going to go down the tube. Well, I say, before we despair completely and just toss in the towel, we need to make one last try at escaping our demonic other, and that the way to do it is through, and this leads me by a Viconian recurso back to archaic revival. We need to reach back into time and attempt to understand what happened to us and how we fell into history and how its institutions have served us badly and diminished and degraded our humanness. And then we need to begin a fundamental reconstruction of human institutions with an eye toward creating a viable, balanced, nature-honoring, human-honoring set of institutions. So does this mean I advocate in a world of epidemic diseases that we return to orgies on every new and full moon? I don't think so. It's hardly possible. But what it does mean is that the tool which lay behind all these changes, which was the ego-dissolving power of psilocybin, needs to be looked at very carefully. We need to examine the possibility that we could re-engineer ourselves so that we could emotionally connect with the consequences of what we have been doing to ourselves and the planet. I mean, when people take psychedelics, this is what they realize. They lose the hold on their little world. You know, they're saving money for a Mercedes or breast implants or some damn thing. You know, then you take one of these things and then you get the big picture. And then you realize just where that Mercedes lies in, the long march to the stars. In other words, we see this in the rainforest cultures today. They have no high level of material culture. And yet it's not because they're not interested in beauty or poetry. It's that they simply live in a much more mental world than we do. The peculiar obsession of the Western mind is its demonic relationship to matter. that we don't believe anything is real unless it's made of stuff. And, any idea, any notion has to somehow be concretized. This is a kind of neurotic response, in my opinion. I mean, the cultures with those civilizations with no material culture whatsoever are in a much more dynamic relationship to nature. It's our obsession with stuff that is pushing us toward Armageddon. I mean, we seriously propose to bring every man, woman, and child on Earth to the level of the life standard roughly approximating that of the average dweller of this island. Well, I've got news for you. There isn't enough metal, glass, plastic, and petroleum in the planet to do that. And in fact, it's causing the toxification of our world. Unfortunately, we live under a social system that is stuff obsessed. We must have money in order to get things, and the number of things around that they're telling you you need is beyond your ever being able to satisfy yourself. We have been told that what is within is nothing, and that all meaning lies in the exterior world. So only science has meaning, only property has meaning, and in fact, the felt presence of immediate experience is the only thing you will ever truly possess. The felt presence of immediate experience. It's the quality of that determines whether you're a happy or unhappy person. And you can be dying of intestinal parasites in some hut in the Amazon, and if your felt quality of immediate experience is superior, then you're superior to the guy who's being chauffeured around in an air-conditioned limousine in some urban center somewhere. Our whole cultural delivery system denies this, So we have the concept of entertainment and of drugs. I mean, to my mind, television is a far more insidious drug than heroin, and that they're very comparable. They're cousins. The difference between heroin and television is that at least on heroin you can think your own thoughts. On television, they don't even give you the option to do that. You imbibe a manufactured data stream, the main purpose of which is to introduce you to the cosmetically enhanced surfaces of certain products which you don't need. The average American watches 6 hours of TV a day. This means that millions and millions of people are being maintained in a semi-larval stage. I mean, we might as well store them in enormous underground banks somewhere, and someday we may. I mean, this society is hard enough to manage. What if all these people unplugged themselves and began running around making demands on the political institutions and the infrastructure? Then we'd really have a problem. So better they should stay in the suburbs. People magazine is delivered, the telly is there. They trouble no one, but they do consume. There is no mundane future. I mean, if we had the chairman of the World Bank and those people here, they draw curves that will stand your hair on end. They show you that the world population, the extraction of petroleum, the rise of poverty, the poisoning of the atmosphere, the accumulation of toxins in the food chain. You draw all these curves and you discover that sometime between the year 2000 and 2040, life as we know it becomes absolutely impossible on the surface of this planet. That's what the sober, unstoned people say. So then the rest of us are supposed to come to terms with this in some sense, and you can either despair and say, well, then we're just, the momentum of 1,000 years of chuckle-headedness is just going to slam us into the wall of planetary limitation at a speed of about 5,000 miles an hour, or we have to sort through our toolkit and find the right wrench to get this sinking submarine back up to the surface. Let's disarm Captain Nemo and his friends and put the people who want to go into the lifeboats, and then these clowns can do any damn thing they want to. Well, when you sort through the cultural toolkit, trying to find the magic key, it is hallucinogenic plants. As far as I can tell, I mean, I'm just one guy, but I read widely, I traveled widely, I've been around the block, and my impression is that this is a tremendous long shot, but it's the only plan around. Nobody else has any other plan. What are you supposed to do? Wait for the friendly space brothers to come and pull your chestnuts out of the fire? I just don't get, I'm underwhelmed by the evidence that that's about to occur. Maybe it's about to occur. I don't regard myself as having an answer. I more like have a clue. I sorted through, just as I assume you are doing, trying to figure out, taking seriously what Alan Watts and Joe Campbell and all those people, Jung, trying to figure out, what are these people talking about? Is it just abstract? Can it ever be reached? And I sat at the feet of various rishis, roshis, geishas, and gurus. I swept up around the ashram and so forth and so on. And, these people just don't have the moxie. I mean, maybe they've got something, but we don't have 1,000 years to unravel this thing. It is a sinking submarine. Chatter is now out of bounds. Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. And my model for these psychedelics is, if you push me, ultimately mathematical. I mean, I think that when we say we dissolve a boundary, when we say that the psilocybin dissolves all boundaries, another way of putting that is to say that we rise to a higher dimension, where what were boundaries now have been erased. And I mean another dimension in a very mathematical and formal sense. And there is a dimension from which the past, the present, and the future are equally discernible, and you go into that place. Shamanism, a good definition of shamanism, a psychedelic definition, is a shaman is somebody who has seen the end. That's all. And if you've seen the end, then you come back and take your place in the play with an entirely different attitude. In the mountains of the Sierra Mazateca of central Mexico, there are Mixtec and Mazatec Indians, the only place in the world where living mushroom cults with ancient roots still exist. The mushrooms were discovered in 1953 by Gordon and Valentina Wasson because they went to these villages and uncovered this thing. People thought it had been wiped out with the Spanish conquest, but it hadn't. It had just retreated into the Oaxacan interior and been kept alive. One way that I think about these Aboriginal peoples is that they kept the secret while we descended into history. They stayed at home and kept the old secrets, and we descended into matter. We made a kind of pilgrimage, and we call it human history. Now it's over. Now we have to take what we've learned from this demonic pilgrimage into the domain of the material and use it to save the planet, to care for the planet. The only justification for history is if we use what we've learned to care for life on the planet. And we may end up, using thermonuclear weapons to destroy incoming space junk that imperils the ecology of the planet. There may be tasks for which only high technology is adequate. That, if an asteroid is going to strike the Earth, you don't want to be a rainforest shaman in that situation. You want to be in command of intercontinental ballistic missiles with high lift capability that can take a 50 megaton weapon out there and blow this thing to smithereens. I see our bodhisattvic obligation as a biological obligation, that we are to care for the Earth. After all, the earth cared for us, and we're like scabies or something, you know? I mean, it can't be very much fun for a planet to have a species on it which is always extracting petroleum and spreading plutonium around and dumping junk into the oceans and the atmosphere. I just said, you know, my God, what is this? It's a raging viral infection of some sort. And yet, we may be the means to a technology that would actually then give us a destiny, save history from just being madness, century after century of rape and pogrom and just, you know, the horror that it is. I'd like to redeem that. I'm like Stephen Dedalus. I'd like to awaken from the nightmare. Mircea Eliade once made a wonderful statement. He said, he was comparing our culture to a dying person. And he said, in the same way that a dying person sees their whole history flash before their eyes, a dying culture will frantically publish everything in one last final spasm of fear. Every Egyptian text, every Tibetan text, every Hopi prophecy, everything will be published, because they're looking for answers. Somewhere it has to be. Did the Tibetans know it? Did the Witoto know it? Did the Inuit know it? Who knows it? We've got to find out. And eventually they'll get around to saying, well, now what about these psychedelic people? We've been jailing them and hounding them for years. They claim they have an answer. And they'll say, you know, get them. Get them on the line. We'll talk to anybody at this point. Bad times lie ahead. Things are going to get worse before they get better, but they're going to get better. The problem, as I see it, with the West is in a search for philosophical economy, of which there's nothing wrong with philosophical economy, but in a frantic search for philosophical economy, we did great damage to our intuition. And what this gave us is monotheism. Monotheism is a very good idea on the first pass and not such a good idea on the second pass, because if you take a page from Jung, as I try to do, you know that the religious ontology of a culture reflects its innermost psychology. And the idea of monotheism, one God, omnipresent, omnipotent, unforgiving, and everywhere, is an image of the male ego. That's all it is. It's an enshrining of the ideal personality as defined by that society. And yet what it creates is complete denial of the messy, felt, pluralistic, feminine, organic, emotional side of being. So one has become enslaved to a kind of Platonic abstraction of which all life and color and feeling has been poured out of it. And you just have, you know, the patriarchal ego. And this is not very far behind us. I mean, some of us were probably raised by people like this, you know, the idea of male rectitude. We're all pretty mellow, even the most uptight of us, compared to the style of male presentation of, say, 100 years ago. You know, 100 years ago, women referred to their husbands as Mr. Get into it. You know, in the 16th century, medical students had to steal corpses off the gallows and from battlefields in order to do dissections, because the church would not allow dissection of corpses to take place. So medical students of that era risked imprisonment in order to obtain corpses so that they could find out how the human body worked. This is the kind of situation that we're in. Constipated patriarchal institutions are standing directly astride the forward progress of the human race. I mean, you know, if you want to boil it down to a slogan, and I'll just leave you with this, we call these substances consciousness-expanding agents. Well, now, if consciousness does not play a major part in the future history of our species, then what kind of a future history are we talking about? You know, are we going to become stupider, duller, more animal-like? I don't think so. Consciousness is our defining quality, and it must be nourished, encouraged, catalyzed, never more so than now, because we have a planet in peril. The entire evolutionary enterprise may rest on the kinds of decisions we make about how we order and carry out our priorities over the next 50 years. We need all the help we can get, and these plants have always been there to render counsel and give advice to evolving human populations that would humbly and reverently seek their input. That's all. Thank you very much.